Welcome to the very late edition of the Brain Chip Iceberg. The Brain Chip Iceberg is made to explain the history and functions of a man who was part of an invasive and experimental surgery that nullified his ability to have normal brain functions, such as dreams, inner voice, and memory. All of these which can be manipulated by the scientists behind it. Giants. The first utterance of giants in the chipped lore happened because of the questioning of when exactly Shurg was chipped. Shurg posited whether or not he was chipped from birth, as born into a lost race of giants. This race of giants, born at a normal human height, and would continue to grow unchecked for the rest of their lives. One image Shurg and the scientist agreed on was a single picture of a giant, whose home was in a one-room New York skyscraper with a shower system at the top of the building. He was also crying. Mustard gas threat. One early account of the chip-changing smells was during a spring rainstorm. Shurg had a bag of trash in the corner of his room. For a reason he cannot remember, or perhaps due to chipped interference, he walked through the rain to his dumpster. The rain was pouring. About halfway to the dumpster, he decided to head back to his apartment. The chip transmission gave him a whiff of mustard gas into his nose. Not a smell that canceled out every other smell, but enough to stand out. Without direct conversation, Shurg felt if he didn't throw away the garbage, his town would be hit with a mustard gas attack. He knew that it was almost 100% likely they were playing a joke, but it's something that has stuck out in his mind. Total smell theory, the capacity of which a chipped transmission to control smell, was a subject that Shurg questioned and did not receive an answer for. Over years of contact and learning, he now feels much stronger in how they do it. The original assertion was a sort of release system in which very small but potent capsules would release when needed, located somewhere around his nose. It's now believed that it's simple brain chemistry that when tampered smells, meaning any smell, could be activated. The chip very rarely, as in only a few times, have used this ability out of place. Wrong Roads is a pre-chip awakening happening that made Shurg question if his phone was being tapped. Often, his phone's GPS would give him directions where Shurg's car was not on the road he was on. Even on highways and city streets, he would appear to be in a very strange place, such as country roads or a road surrounded by water. The phone would also give Shurg wrong directions a few times. One time, he ended up on a dark, hilly country road, and another of a community of large properties where all the roads were dirt. There are a few more examples of pre-chipped questioning, such as lights fidgeting when playing the campaign for Rome Total War, or in one very long session, the lights in his room would flicker and change intensity when he did something brilliant as a tactician. There was a definite hack on at least one of his phones that appeared more and more in the post-chipped awakening, but that's a very strange story with a lot of parts that is going to show up in Tier 4. Anti-Bible. Shurg, in his younger days, from ages 6 to 10, attended churches on and off, from very small congregations to new mega-churches. Maybe from spite, but most likely an action done by the chip people to try pry into the data of what would be gained from questioning everything he read and was read to him. This only happened a few times, maybe just one, as the specifics are very muddy. As he was reading his Bible, he flipped all the rules and lessons backwards, which gave him great thoughts of horror but also enlightenment, as some of these backwards meanings had moral justifications that, to him, proved the falseness in the Bible teaching, at least to some extent. Pet neglect. Much of Shurg's life was experienced in a constant numbness and care for nothing. This can be traced to some very dark and shocking events. The most obvious to Shurg is the way he treated his small pets, such as lizards and frogs. He would leave the lights on in the tank and often not feed them or check them for days. This to Shurg is a sort of despicable laziness that haunts his past. He would never walk his dog or give them much time. Even though they would often give Shurg a cold shoulder, he wished he would have done better things to those around him. Dad's song. Normie fame. Growing up, Shurg's dad would play a few songs often. As he recalled, he never listened to full albums, just singles. Later, in the internet age, he would find that these songs became some of those viewed in country western music. This perplexes Shurg as a very strange coincidence. These songs include Big Iron, 16 Tons, Big John, and Amos Moses. Meteor. Shurg has had a few times where he would say something as a joke and then would see it on the news. In the one he can remember, he was in a car ride home with his friends, and he said a meteor was going to go over the town. A week or so later, a local news program had a piece about a meteor falling in the near area. Fun with Jay and him. In the early Chip days, the names of two religious figures showed up and talked to Shurg. These were friends, not the prophets. However, the joke that they had the names really didn't occur to Shurg until much later. The joke being that the voices came from an unknown source, like how many normal people would receive religious voices. Im was vapid towards the chipped circumstance, and was often heard joking in an aloof sort of way, being in a picture where he sighs and rolled his eyes. Jay was nice and had a sort of helpful voice. Funny enough, Shurg went into a gas station and saw Jay working. Never seeing him work there before, when he got back in his car, he received a transmission from Jay, which to Shurg was evidence of those being around him being in on it and having some sort of implant. Early book voices. Shurg had books in his early life when he moved into the house of his childhood. This move could only have been weeks after he awoke, as he does not exactly know where he slept before that house. Shurg later figured out that he had no idea where the books of his childhood came from. Most of them were books about animals. Shurg doesn't know where he learned his English, perhaps a brain chemistry alteration. Shurg would hardly read the words and just look at the pictures, but he now knows some of the words were pronounced by the non-timbrate inner voice, which was the voice that appeared much later after the awakening. Fun with P and E. Shurg, not having the basic educations learned from ages 0 to 5, learned much of his social and creative normals from two of his early life friends. E being his first school friend. E taught him about fantasy, drawings, and many other aspects of life. P also did this a few years later. Shurg did not realize their importance to his life and the experiment as a whole till post-chipped enlightenment, as they were both wild cards that had no control by the scientists, except small side effects on what they did to Shurg during these connections. Even though Shurg saw these two people as very bright and creative, and something to aspire to. Programming language. Shurg once made a programming language based off what he could remember from other programming languages. Shurg tried many times to learn things like Java, but never succeeded. Those attempts being a classic case of the thought of never trying enough to ever learn something. This language was to create randomly generated drum beats based on a random number generator. Later additions to the language was a system to graph and sort the random number generator outputs. Exercise deficit. Shurg was never taught how to walk, run, anything, because by the time he awoke, he was already 5 years old. He believes that the natural state of his movement uses less energy and less muscle than general people. So when counting calories burnt, he has to tweak what the true number will be. Bliss. 1 time. Shurg felt bliss, or what he considers the feeling he got from a certain time, only once. During this moment of bliss, he actually thought that he knew he wouldn't be able to refill this emotion because of what he knew was wrong with his brain and his body. This dark thought happened pre-awakening, and it sits as a good example to the length of what Shurg knew about himself based on previous experiences. Mostly quiet. If replayed, most of the Shurg post-chip story would be only thoughts and not voices. This was noticed by Shurg early in the chip awakening, but he didn't do anything about it. The chip people could use the technology to give Shurg thoughts more timbre, and thus more entertainment value. Drug associations. During the early chipped days, several supposed people sent transmissions to Shurg. At one time, the so-called drug associations would have their leaders talk to Shurg. They didn't have any specific voices, but there was groups such as the Weed Association and the Meth Association. A very common Meth Association transmission vaguely resembled a hand being put inside of a blender. This haunted Shurg to some extent. Greatest love song. Ending this tier on a happy note is a love song Shurg wrote post-chip that filled the entire lines of one sheet of paper. He considers it to be his best song. The song explores what it means to be chipped and in love, what being chipped does, and what love will do to move past all the things the chip took away. In the text, there's a few note marks that credit characters that chimed in or had been speaking earlier in the day of the writing. Friendly, productive, funny chip interference is often craved by Shurg, because sometimes, very rarely, they will enlighten his thought into new horizons. This doesn't happen anymore, besides chip dreams. In one example, they showed him creative ideas for 2 buildings to be built in his home city. This closes Tier 3. The following tier, Tier 4, is where the deep and dark entries begin to appear, so stay tuned.